Moving over to the Tennessee Volunteers, and this might be one of the biggest question marks in the entire country. I think Tennessee is one of those teams that could win the national championship or have an 8-4 season. I really think the gap for them this year is very, very real. They lose a ton of production. It's partly about how much do you value the pieces that were lost, because I look at what was lost. And I look at Dylan Sampson, for example. He was the SEC Offensive Player of the Year at the running back spot. This was the number one ranked rushing offense in the country. They were amazing at running back last year behind Dylan Sampson. I also look at their wide receivers. Some might say, yeah, I don't think the receivers were all that great. And others would say, yeah, well, they lost 3 of the top 4 and 4 of the top 6. So even if they weren't great, you still have to replace an awful lot of production. And you look at the defensive line. You look at all the pieces that they lost, headlined by James Pierce, that edge presence that was always there. They probably had 5 guys along the defensive line that were really concerning for the opposing offense. Then you probably are going to take the glass half full perspective as well. They rotated a lot of guys last year. There's young guys that are poised to take over and that are ready to become household names. They just haven't had that opportunity yet. By the way, I'm not saying that either side of these arguments are wrong. I'm just suggesting the gap and the evaluation for Tennessee. There's a big, big divide with a lot of people. Some people love them. Some people think there's a lot of things to account for. And then finally, the offensive line. Tackles last year, massive liability. Surely they can't be as bad at tackle last year. Well, those guys started for a reason. What if they're still bad at tackle the way they were last year and lost games because of how their tackles performed at times? So there's a lot of pieces that are gone. They lost 27 players to eligibility exhaustion last year and the NFL draft. That's a lot to know that 27 players are gone. The good news is they went out and they brought in 29 players, 27 of which are already on campus, and 23 of those 27 were early enrollees to what should be an outstanding recruiting class from this past year. One of the big questions is how much better can they be on offense? And a lot of this hinges on the continued growth and development of Nico Iamaleava. Now, I liked what I saw from him down the stretch. There were some things to like about his progress. Let's just think about Nico's season last year. Start of the season, really strong, really good. Non-conference, lower level competition. I thought he played well. Didn't have to do a ton against some of those teams. For instance, against NC State, like that was a beatdown. Then you look at him against Oklahoma, and while he kind of took what the defense gave him, there were a couple catch and runs that kind of broke things open. Then he went through a little bit of I guess you could call it a slump, where there were a lot of big plays downfield that were missed. And that kind of plagued them in the Arkansas game and made a couple games more uncomfortable than they needed to be. Had he hit 1 or 2 of those downfield, it would have been a completely different story. And then as the season went along, they leaned a little bit more on the run game, including his legs, and he started to hit a few more of those throws downfield. All he's got to do is hit 1 or 2 a game, and the offense changes drastically. So if you really like Tennessee this year, it's probably because you're really a believer in Nico's growth, as he's got all the talent in the world. It's just, can he now do it on a consistent basis and potentially carry some relative inexperience around him? One of the other questions, how are they going to be able to replace Dylan Sampson? Now, they went out, and I think Deshaun Bishop, who is the number 2 last year, he should be in a pretty good spot to get a little bit more. But Star Thomas, transfer from Duke, Peyton Lewis, these are other guys that they now have in at the running back spots. I don't think this is going to be a bell cow type of team. It's going to be a running back by committee, which is perfectly fine, by the way. Still pretty optimistic about what that group might be if they go with a running back by committee, because I think Bishop is relatively underrated. And then the offensive line. Last year, the offensive line had some struggles. There were games where it was like, man alive, this is just not what you're looking for. They gave up some sacks from time to time. They gave up over nearly 2.5 sacks a game, 30 plus in 2024. 8 came from the tackle, in particular the right side. of the offensive line. So they need to solidify that position. They went out and got one of the top offensive linemen in the country in David Sanders. They think he could start day one as a true freshman as the starting right tackle. Then it's about who's going to be the left tackle. Is it Lance Hurd, the transfer from LSU? Is he the guy that's going to lock down that spot? But that'll be a position I'll be watching very, very closely there on the perimeter of the offensive line. The defense, still think they're going to be pretty good there. I still think in the front, they might not be quite as star-studded as they were a year ago, but Tim Banks is going to find a way to apply pressure. I believe that. I continue to believe that, and I think that group will be perfectly fine with some of the pieces they return, even though there's a lot of really good parts that are gone from last season. Schedule's tough. SEC schedule, it always is. They're Georgia at home, at Alabama on the third Saturday in October. Oklahoma comes to them before they go to Florida there on November 22nd. Those are some of the key games. And I look at the playoff forecast. I think it's absolutely possible for Tennessee this year. That's where I'm putting it. I say it's possible, but when I say possible, I think it's about 50-50 for Tennessee this year. It's going to kind of hinge on how they play at Florida and how they play at Alabama. But I'm pretty optimistic about the progress they're going to make at a few key positions to make another run at the postseason.